What is good in the hood, my homies and homettes? Welcome to another tutorial where today we are going to master React. Everything that you need to know about React to build your own applications by building the ultimate modal. So it's going to have, we can check the behavior here. So I've called it my crappy modal. We open it up. It looks pretty. We've got some secret font effects that I'm going to show you how to do. We're going to learn how to use Flexbox and grid for placement. It's going to respond to close modal button, off click, and escape key close. In this tutorial we're going to learn how to pass props in React and use state, use effect, use ref, and use callback, so it's got all that good information. And if you're here from my coding playlist to get your first developer job in only 4 months, we also have a second video that I'd recommend you go and check out after this, and it's a Catamines React Native tutorial. So after you've done this modal, you've got the basis of React down. I'd recommend practicing your skills by picking up React Native in this tutorial here. Super similar in terms of how the both systems work, and this has the added benefit of you can host your own app, have it live on the Google Play Store or iPhone App Store, and add it to your portfolio, and you can say you can do React and React Native. But without further ado, let's get into the code. So once more, this is what we're going to be building. So I'm just going to close, well actually I'm going to open up a terminal. So from my terminal, what I'm just going to do is, I'm already in the folder that I want to do, so I'm going to do npx create React app. And I'm going to call it modal tutorial. So this is assuming that you already have React installed on your computer. And if I just run that, it's going to initialize our React app, and that will just take a second, and I will see you back here when that is done. Cool, so now that that is finished installing, I'm going to use my special commands. So I'm going to cd into the folder, which is called Modal tutorial, and I'm going to type code dot, and this is the setting that you configure that will open up your VS Code into that project directory. So that's dope. So that's all working. Now, the other thing that we're going to cover in this tutorial is all the different ways that you can style out a React app and what are the best practices and what aren't. But without further ado, let me just size that down. Let us get this app up and running. So let's type in npm start. And this command comes from here, which is your start script. So you just have to navigate to the project tutorial and type in npm start, and that will get going. So that's going to load up our boilerplate. Let's look at what we have in here. So React works by having an app component that gets loaded into this index.javascript file, which gets rendered in the document get element by ID div root folder. And you can see now that the app is loaded, it's going to show us what it's got inside it in a second. But we're just going to start off by removing some of the unnecessary files to make it a bit more lightweight. So let's get rid of these three. They're just totally not necessary. I'm actually just going to get rid of everything in here. I'm going to go ahead and delete everything but app and index.javascript. And now this will break in a hot second, so we're going to have to also go through and remove all the imports for everything. So I'm going to get rid of those two, get rid of report web vitals, index.css, bare bones in there, that's nice. And I'm also going to navigate in here and just get rid of the rest of the stuff that we just don't need. All this good stuff. So now we're just going to end up with a blank page with nothing in it. Perfect. The next thing we're going to do is come over to our index.html and just add in some basic styling features by adding in a style tag within the head, and we're just going to, just like you would in a regular HTML document, we're just going to go box sizing, border box, margin 0, and padding 0. And that's just going to set some default styles for our entire application. The other thing we're going to do is import a Google font file. So if we go to Google Fonts, let's just go to Google Fonts. I'll make this a bit bigger. Let's just say we import Roboto. This isn't the one that I'll be using, but you select this style. And you want to copy this import tag, and you will paste it also in here. So I'm just going to use one that I have pre-prepared for my particular font. You can copy this from the GitHub code link that I have in the description to this particular project. And I'm using Space Mono. And to get the fire effect that we saw earlier and that we will see again, what you have to do is sneakily this will say CSS2, you just want to make it CSS, and down the end, after display equals swap, you have to add this code in here. And this will add the following 4 effects. So you get 3D float, fire animation, neon, and anaglyph. And we will see what those do soon. So now that we've kind of set up the basic styling for our entire app, let's go build some components. Now, React works based on components. So it's kind of like having a whole lot of containers, and you have containers within containers and all that kind of good stuff. And it's just a good way to space out content and separate it into workable chunks. So, for example, we're building a modal, so I'm going to go into our source folder, make a components folder, and in there I'm going to make a new file called modal.javascript. Now typically separate components are initialized with a capital, and once you're in that file, if it's a JavaScript file, you should just be able to type RFC, and that default command will load you out a modal component that you can now render in here. If I just type modal, it will automatically import it, and we can render out on the screen, and that should all update, and we should have modal just like that appearing just underneath James. And that is essentially how components with React work. The next thing we're going to do is in here we're going to look at state. And so state is basically a user interactable variable. So, normally we can set variables in here just, by writing typical code and assign it to a variable name. When you want the user to interact with a particular thing, you best to use state. So we're going to import React and use state from React. And what that's going to allow us to do is initialize the state. And so you initialize the state by, in this particular example, we're going to call it, what should we call it? I think we will go with open modal. And so the first variable in the array is the variable name that you assign the state to, and the second one is you give it a function to update that, and you typically call it set, whatever you've named it. We're just going to go use state, and we're going to provide it a default value on render, and I'm just going to set it to false. And to see how that kind of works, what we can do is just have a div in here, and we're just going to say, in this particular case, it's going to be good to just use open modal, or actually, just to make it just like the other one, we're going to go open crappy modal. It's not about the looks, it's about the content, so that's all good. And we're just going to give this div an on-click functionality, and that's an anonymous arrow function that sets open modal, and in this particular instance we're going to set it to the opposite of whatever open modal currently is. So just like that. And if we just come up here and console.log open modal, we will see what that all looks like. So let's just come to console, and if I just click our button, you can see how it's just every time I use it, interact with it, it changes that state value using the set open modal functionality. So that's super cool. I actually forgot one last little thing that I want to do, and I'm just going to come back into this index.html, and just like I imported this font, I'm actually going to set it. So font family, and that's just going to give me the font that I'm looking for. Excellent. So that's the basic of state. In this particular case, I actually want this open modal button to set my open modal to true. And I'm going to get rid of James, and I'm also going to make this a wrapper so that we can have some child content in here, like James, for example. Now, you'll notice when I write that it doesn't show up over here, but there is a good reason, and I will describe that soon. Now, in this app component, we're going to style it using inline styles, just to get you familiar with one of the ways that you would style apps. Typically, you wouldn't use inline styles, just because it's not very concise. But just to learn how to do it, what you do is you go style is equal to double squiggly brackets, and you just set your CSS variables in here. So I'm going to set site height as 100 VH and position to relative. And you'll see why I do that soon, but the position needs to be relative because our modal will be positioned absolute, and so it needs to have the app container as the relative parent. Now, the second thing to note is that in React, we pass state between components, how they communicate using props. And so basically what you do is to make a prop, you say, okay, this is what I want it to be recognized as within the component, so I want it to call it title. And I'm just going to pass that a string that says my crappy modal. And so that would be one particular way of passing a string to your component. The other thing I'm going to do is provide it state by just saying open is equal to the current state of open modal, and I'm also going to say that close modal is equal to the function set open modal. Actually, no, I'm not going to do that just yet. We'll come back to that one in a second, that last one. And now, in our modal component, you receive this information as the props or the properties. And you can destructure it using the destructuring syntax, so we can expect a title. We can also expect children. Children is anything rendered between the open and closing tags. And the last one we can expect is open is equal to props. And in here, I could just console.log title, and I should see the title that I passed down. And so that's basically the whole communication system in React. So the next thing we're going to do is write a function. So we're going to go function, and this function is going to be a close modal handler. So I'm just going to call it close modal handler, just to show how functions can also be passed between components. And so this one is just going to set open modal as false. That's all that it does, super simple. And I'm going to once again pass that down here as, I'm just going to call it close modal is equal to close modal handler. Easy. And now if we come in here, we can expect that as well. Handler. Nice. Cool, so that's all that. You can, if you want, if it's getting a bit long, you can separate these onto new lines. Nice and easy. The next thing we're going to do is make some child content. So we're going to make a div. We're just going to say style is equal to, if I wanted to make a border, I wrap it in quotations, and I'll just go 2 pixels solid turquoise. Cool. I'll close that. And then here we're just going to write, this is my only child. Nice. And to render that, we would just come in here, and instead of having modal here, we're just going to have children. And that'll show up. Excellent. So that's the basics of components and passing state. Now, there's one additional thing that we want to do for modals, is you actually want to render them in a totally different div. So in here, as we looked at earlier, all the content is getting rendered under this root div. We actually want to render it in a div called with the ID of portal, and that's just going to enable some of our click off to close functionalities to work perfectly. And to make this work, we have to do the same thing as they've done here and import React DOM into our component. And we also have to follow this particular syntax that they've used. So here, what we want to do is return. So I'm actually just going to get rid of this. We go React DOM dot create. Wait 1 second. I'm actually just going to call this DOM. React DOM dot create portal, and this is where we're going to have our content. So we're just going to go div whatever. I mean, for the second, we can just render out the children. And after the div, you need a comma, and you just have to select the div in which you want to render it. So we want get element by ID, and we just want portal. And so that's gonna, we can't see, well, we can see it down here, but that's just gonna ensure that this gets rendered in a separate div and it logically comes after the first div. So that's all good, that's nice and working. Now what we can do to make this a bit nicer is actually just provide a guard clause. And since we know the state of open, which is our determining whether or not the modal should be open, we can just say if not open. So if open is false, what we can do is this will be true, so we don't want it to render, so we can just return null. And so this is just going to say if the modal state is false, then return nothing, and our portal will not be rendered. So let's have a look. Return null, and if I reload this, you can see that our content is gone, and that's because our state is currently set to false. So this statement returns true, and instead of rendering this portal, we get nothing. Now, the last thing we're going to do in here is just make some minor styling changes. So we're just going to add some styling to this particular div here. And the way I'm going to do it is just once again with the same style tags, and I'm just going to go display grid. And this is just one way of centering content within a div. I'm going to go place items center, and the last thing I'm going to do is cursor set it to pointer so that it looks as if it's a button. So when I hover over it, it's centered and it will be changing my state, and yeah, that's all good. Excellent. So that is pretty much everything in our app component finished. Now we just have to come over to our modal component and start to fill out this content. And we are going to learn how I guess it's the correct way to, or in my opinion, the best way to style a component. And so what we're going to do is we're going to write a modal.module.css. And the module keyword in here makes a CSS file that is scoped locally to the components that import it. So that means that when we import it in here, any h1 styling we set will only apply to h1 tags in this particular document. And to import that document, we just write import styles from /modal.module.css. Nice and easy. Excellent. The next thing we are going to do is start writing out some HTML. And we're going to start off by assigning a class name to this particular div. So in React, you also use class name instead of class. And you can just set them as a string, but if you're using this particular system, you go styles, as we've imported it, dot the name of the class that you want to give it. So I'm going to give this one modal. I'm going to make another div here, and I'm going to give this a class name of styles.modal background. And that's going to provide the dark background that provides contrast to our modal. We're going to go another div with a class name of styles.modal content. And in here, we're going to render out all of our content. So we're just going to have a div, and the first thing we're going to render in our div is the title, and we're going to do some conditional rendering. So to use JavaScript within the HTML sections, use the curly braces, and we're going to provide a statement that says if title exists, render this content. So if title, we want to render an h1 tag that has a class name, and the next thing we're going to learn is how to apply two classes to a particular thing. And to do that, we use backticks. And in here, we're going to have styles.modal header. So that's going to be the first class. Then you add a space. And then we're going to have the second class, which is how we apply the Google font stuff. And if I open that, it's not working just a second, but it will soon. Let's just come back here. But yeah, basically the moral of the story is that this will apply the font effect animation, and this will apply the modal header styles, only if tile exists. If you have content that you want to render one thing or another, you can just go, so if children exists, so if we have something between our opening and closing modal tags, we can just go children, and then if children is true, render the first thing. So we're going to use fragments, and fragments is just like a div, a wrapper, except it's like, imagine it's just completely got no walls. You can't style it, it's just a fragment. And in here we're going to render children if it's true, and then we provide the else shorthand, and then we're just going to have another fragment that says no children, GG. I'll put that down into a new line. And so that's the other way you can kind of conditionally render content, which is all good. The last thing we're going to need in here is a button, and this is going to be an on-click of equal to close modal, so we're just passing it the function that we gave it through, and we're going to give this a class name of styles.closeButton. Excellent, close that, and just say close modal. So now that we have all of this, we are going to, close modal. And that is because I passed it down as close modal. Cool. Close modal is not defined. No, that was from our last one. So if I render that again, we shouldn't get any errors. Nice. Now let's come into our style sheet. We're going to start off by styling our .modal. So that is this first one just here. And we are going to give this a position of absolute, and it's going to be positioned absolute relative to the parent container. We're going to go an inset of 0, which is just top, left, right, and bottom is equal to 0. We're going to display flex, and we're going to go justify content center and align items center. And so before we use grid, place item center, you can also center items using justify content center and align item center. The next thing we're going to do is make the modal background. We're going to give that also a position of absolute and an inset of 0 because it's going to occupy the same space. We're going to give it a Z index of 5. Keeping in mind that to use a Z index you have to have a position set. We're going to give it a background of black and an opacity of 0.7. Nice. Then we're going to do the modal content, and that is going to go position relative, which is just default, but once again we have to set it to give it a Z index of 10 so that it sits above the background. We're going to go width of 600 pixels, max width of 100 VW, height 600 pixels, max height 100 VH, view height, background of white, display flex and flex direction column because the standard flex direction is as a row. Next we're going to do the modal header, and so this is going to be text align center. Actually, before I continue, let's just see if we can get this opening up. Yeah, so here you can see our modal, that's cool. And if I click that, it should close. Nice. So text align center, we want a padding of padding, 20 pixels top and bottom, and 0 otherwise. We want to text transform, set everything to uppercase. We want letter spacing, TT, 4 pixels, spread it out a bit, and then we just want a user select none, so that no user can select anything. And this should be applied for the header, but notice that here I've actually forgotten to actually render the header. And so to render JavaScript, once again, you have to use it inside the curly braces. And here we can see the font effect that I was talking about, which is the fire effect, which is super nice. And so if I were to get rid of this, it would only apply that first style, which is super boring. You can also do the other ones, so like neon or anaglyph, depending on which you prefer. I actually kind of like the neon. Fire effect, font animation. Let's keep it like that. Cool. Last things to style is the modal content. And so this is just going to select all divs within that. And so we're going to go box, shadow of inset. So it sets it inwards. We're going to go 0, 0, 4 pixels, blur, 4 pixels spread, and yellow. It's going to look terrible, but that doesn't matter. And flex 1 so that it occupies all available space and pushes our close modal button to the bottom. And lastly, we have the close modal button. We're going to go background purple, color white, font weight of 900, font size 2 rem, and margin 0 left and right and auto. 0 top and bottom and auto, so that's going to center everything. Nice. Except I called it close button, so let's make sure that's right. Close button. Nice, excellent. Cool, so that's all of that. The last things we have to do is apply some of our escape button and on-click handling. And to do that, we're going to have to import some things. So just like we imported useState in the other app component, here we're going to import useRef, useEffect, and useCallback. So useRef is basically like useReference, and a reference is something that persists across renders. So when React re-renders content, it will reset everything to its default value. If you use a useReference, it will persist that. So if you set a value, you say, let this variable equal useRef and set it a default of 3, and then you say, okay, useRef, let's set this to 8 and re-render the content, it will persist it as 8. The other thing you can use it for is giving it reference to particular divs. And in this case, I'm going to say, set this one as my reference div, so modal ref, and I have to initialize it by saying const modal ref is equal to useRef. And this is just going to say, okay, make this useRef refer to this div, and that's going to be used for our onClick. So if our onClick hits this referenced div, it will close the div. And to do that, we're going to use a useEffect. And useEffect takes an anonymous function, and you give it a dependency array, and it's basically like a tracker. And so it's whenever this thing occurs, whenever this tracked event occurs, run the code within inside the useEffect. So if you have an empty array, that's just going to do it on page load or state load. Otherwise, it will, if you say on title change, run this code, whenever title changes, it will run that code. But before we do that, we have to define the functions that we're going to use in here. So the first one is key press. So this is going to use useCallback, and so useCallback takes an event and returns a function. And what useCallback does is it's like a performance functionality or hook of React, where typically, as I said, whenever you re-render content, it reruns all the script within the page. And that can be, if you're redefining big functions, that can be expensive in terms of your processing. And so use callback just says, okay, let's just define this once, give it a dependency array for whenever it might need to be redefined, and otherwise let's just not redefine it, keep it, and every time it re-renders, it will not recreate this whole function. And so we're going to give this open and close modal. So every time the state changes, it's going to redefine this function instead of constantly. And we're just going to say if e.keyPress is equal to escape, and open is true, so the modal is open, we're just going to use that close modal functionality and call that function. And we're going to define this in here, so we're just going to go document.add event listener. We're going to say key press, key down, and we're just going to give it key press. Use effects also, they don't always, but occasionally they'll take a cleanup function. And so we're just going to give it an anonymous function that cleans all this code up, and we're just going to say document.remove event listener, same thing, key down, and key press. And that's just going to, but you don't, that code isn't typically necessary only for this functionality. And the next function we're going to define is just going to be a standard one, so function close modal handler. You could define this as above using the use callback or not, but in this case we're just going to e.stop propagation. And that just means any clicks don't go outwards from the div that we click on. And we're just going to say if modal ref.current, so that's that reference. If it exists, so if the modal is loaded, we're going to go if modal ref.current is equal to e.target. So if our click target finds this referenced modal, so the background, we're also just going to close modal. And then just like before, we're going to use a use effect to attach that code to particular events. And in here we just need the dependency of key press, and in here we'll need the dependency. We're just going to actually make this one to run on page load. And so this is just going to be document.add event listener, mouse down. We're going to give it close modal handler, and we're just going to return an anonymous function that cleans that up. So may as well just copy this whole line. Nice. And now that we've done that, we should have, so our close modal closes the modal, our escape, our off click closes the modal, but for some reason our escape is not working. Key down, key press, is that working? Let's try that. Open, escape. Why is escape not working? That is because, this needs to be e.key, not key press. And so now if I open it and escape, that's all working nicely too. So off click closes it, close modal closes it. You can see that our styling is applied. It looks terrible, but that's what we were going for. And yeah, that's the ultimate modal. It's even rendered in a different portal, so it couldn't get any tidier. We've learned all the different main functionalities of React, so you should be able to build any components with their scoped styles and all that good stuff. And if you enjoyed the tutorial, please consider liking and subscribing. Watch the rest of my videos if you want to learn everything you need to know to get your first developer job 2022 style, and I will see you soon for another video. Catch you guys later.